Well, thank you so much for joining us for our conversation today. We are being joined by some of our wonderful Hispanic pastors here at the Desert Southwest Conference of the United Methodist Church, and author Karen Gonzalez, who has written a wonderful book titled The God Who Sees, Immigrants, the Bible, and the Journey to Belong. And we're so glad that she was able to join us today, so that we pastors in our conference can have this important resource for Hispanic Heritage Month. Let's see. I'm going to invite the pastors who are joining us to just kind of tell us their name and where they're joining us from.
My name is Antonieta Fernandez, and I am serving at Christ Community United Methodist Church, Avondale, Arizona.
I'm Dottie Escobedo-Frank, and I am serving at Paradise Valley United Methodist Church in Paradise Valley, Arizona.
I'm Alma Aguirre-Olivares, and I serve at Shepherd of the Hills United Methodist Church in Sun City, Arizona.
My name is Raul Velasquez. I'm serving in El Mesias United Methodist Church in Nogales, Arizona.
And we have Pastor Agustin.
Yes, good morning. Pastor Agustin Jimenes. I'm serving here in Tucson, Arizona, New Hope United Methodist Church, Nueva Esperanza.
Thank you for joining us. And of course, our guest of honor is Karen Gonzalez, a speaker, writer, and immigrant advocate who works as the Director of Human Resources for World Relief, an immigrant from Guatemala. Gonzalez studied at Fuller Theological Seminary. She has worked in the nonprofit world for more than 10 years and is a former public school teacher. Gonzalez, who lives in Baltimore, has written about spiritual formation, Latinx identity, race, gender, the Enneagram, and immigration. Her work has been published in Sojourners, Evangelicals for Social Action, Christ and Pop Culture, Christianity Today, Mutuality Magazine, The Mud Room, and The Salt Collective. And if you want to connect with her and learn more about her work and the things that she's been up to, you can check out her website, Karen-Gonzalez.com. Does that sound about right, Karen?
That sounds right.
All right. Yes. Wonderful. Well, Karen, thank you so much. I want to give you an opportunity to some time for you to lead with some information with a presentation. And then after that, we'll have some time for a conversation. Some our pastors, I'm sure, have some questions, some things they'd like to share, some responses to your work. All right. So, Karen, once again, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, it's good to be here with you, pastoras y pastores. Like what I told you, I'm from Guatemala. I moved to this country when I was 10 years old, and I actually spent a big part of my childhood in Southern California in Los Angeles for a while. So I'm a little bit familiar with that part of the Southwest. And I want to talk to you a little bit. I'm actually writing another book on immigration and some of the ideas I'm going to share with you today. This is some of the things that I'm writing, that I wrote in my new book that's going to come out on immigration. Because I think for many of us in ministry, we already have a healthy view of welcoming refugees and other immigrants. We understand the biblical command to care for people who are vulnerable, who are in need. And yet I feel like in the church, sometimes the conversation always stops at hospitality. As a matter of fact, I remember, for a long time, my father, when we were children, he would tell us, we're guests here in the United States, so we have to be better. Because when you're a guest, you behave better than when it's your home. And that's what was ingrained in us, that we were guests. But, as much as I love my father, I think he was wrong on that kind of thinking. And this is why I call this presentation Beyond Hospitality. And one of the things that I became aware of is that the first displaced people in North America were indigenous people in Mesoamerica, in Mexico, in North America, Canada, and the United States. They were the first people who were forcibly moved. This was their home and they were asked to leave. And yet that's a conversation. We don't often hear that in the conversation around immigration, that there were people who were forced. And, many of us who are mestizos are part indigenous in some way. And it was really our people who were pushed, who were forced out. And in Baltimore, these people are the Lumbee, Piscataway, and Cherokee tribes who were moved off of their lands. People often talk about where I live as the first Catholic colony, because Maryland was a Catholic colony. But even before then, it belonged to other people who were then displaced. So I want to just take a moment to hold some space for our indigenous people who lost their homes while other people came in. Thank you. And I want us to talk about a little bit about words first. So words are, the first thing I heard about immigration was from my parents, and my father said we were guests. And so I really think words are important. And I love that in the Gospel of John, Jesus himself is described as a word. We read in the Gospel that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and all things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we saw his glory. So this Word became flesh, and to me, it's so fascinating that something as light and airy as a word can take on flesh, can become a lived reality, can become, in this case, the Son of God. And to me, it reveals a lot about the power of words. And I often think about how my father's words shaped my own identity as a person living in the United States permanently, because we weren't returning to Guatemala, we were here permanently. And yet I continue to think of myself as a guest because this is what my father told me, right? I think there are other words that are better and that are stronger. When I became a US citizen, I had to fill out a petition. It's called the I-400, and it's a petition for naturalization. Now, I was reading a book a little bit about a year ago by an indigenous writer named Robin Wall Kimmerer. And I think this word naturalized is a very beautiful word. Listen to this is what she says about it. Being naturalized to a place means to live as if this is the land that feeds you, as if these are the streams from which you drink, that build your body and fill your spirit. To become naturalized is to know that your ancestors lie in this ground. Here you will give your gifts and meet your responsibilities. To become naturalized is to live as if your children's future matters. To take care of the land as if our lives and the lives of all our relatives depend on it. And I love this idea. I think it's really beautiful to think of immigrants as people who migrate to a new land and then become naturalized to this place. It becomes a part of them. And this becomes the place, or I put in italics, where they give their gifts and when they meet all their responsibilities. I don't think the US government intended this with that petition, but I think this word is very beautiful and very important to think of ourselves this way as people who migrate and then are natural to that space. And I think words are really important. They shape our reality. They shape the way that we perceive things and the way that we think about them. And this is why I think it's really important that a lot of the discourse in the church needs to change regarding immigrants and immigration, because I feel like the words that we use often separate us. They create more distance between us instead of helping us to become closer to think of each other as family. So sometimes when I've talked about this, people say, well, they're just words, who cares? It's not as important, right, as actions. And I agree. I think actions are important too, but we have to decide what we want to do. This Phuc Tran, who is a former refugee from Vietnam, he wrote in his book about his own migration experience. And he says, do we want words to be powerful or powerless? We can't have it both ways. If we want them to be powerful, we have to act and speak accordingly, handling our words with the fastidious faith that they can do immeasurable good or irreparable harm. But if we want to say whatever we want, if we want to loose whatever words fly into our minds, then we render words meaningless, ineffectual, powerless. So one of the things that Phuc Tran invites us to consider is, I want you to look at a couple of phrases that I have here. So one is, if it wouldn't have rained, we would have gone to the beach. Okay. So it rained and we didn't go, right? But if it wouldn't have rained, we could have fulfilled this dream, right? Going to the beach. It rained, so we had a picnic on the living room floor and watched a movie together. So it still rained, but I want you to look at the difference between these two sentences. One has more of a conditional tense, right? If it wouldn't have rained, then we could have done this thing. And one communicates something entirely different. It rained, so this is what we actually did. It's just a simple past tense. So, you have the first sentence here. It communicates a kind of disappointment and a sadness, maybe longing. But the second sentence communicates more resiliency, flexibility, adaptability, right? It rained, so we made lemonade out of our lemons. We just changed the plan and we did something different. This is the way that words can influence the way that we think and the way that we feel. Now, I want you to look. These are the words that I hear a lot in connection to immigrants and immigration. These are the good words, by the way. We stand with the vulnerable. We stand with the least of these. We welcome the stranger. We welcome refugees. We're not afraid. We're glad you're our neighbor. I see signs all over certain parts of Baltimore that, are in 3 different languages that say, we're glad you're our neighbor. Christ-like welcome is another thing that I hear. And of course, the voice for the voiceless. And so these are the common terms that I hear that are positive. But I want you to notice something about these words. In many ways, what's happened with these words is we remove the person. Oh, sorry, let me go back. We remove the person from them. So the voiceless, the vulnerable, the least of these. And it's interesting because with the least of these, they're quoting Jesus, but Jesus actually says, with the least of these, my brothers and sisters. He finishes, that phrase. And we're not afraid. So we're putting the word fear and the word refugees in the same, declaration. And then we're glad you're our neighbor. Somebody is the we that gets to welcome, and somebody is the neighbor, the object of the sentence that gets to be welcomed, right? Same thing with we welcome refugees. There's an inherent power dynamic here. There's a we that welcomes and the refugees that get welcomed, right? These are very subtle and nuanced differences, but they communicate something really, really powerful, because what a lot of these words do is they reduce people to a single characteristic of their experience. It removes humanity in some ways. They're just the vulnerable, the least of these, the voiceless. So it's not even people who are in vulnerable situations, right? People who are marginalized. It's just the vulnerable, the least of these, right? So these terms really widen the distance between us. And the more that they become part of our speech, the more that they inform our imagination, so that we can't perceive of other options. Immigrants, refugees are always the other, the people who get welcomed, and then there are those who get to welcomed. And that's just what these words say. So the issue is that language has power. So it has the power to do a lot of harm. And in this case, what happens is we remove humanity, right? And it affects the way that we think about our siblings. And it also impacts the way we conceive reality. We just reduce them to an experience. So that's the power of language. And the reason this matters is because it has other implications. So, for example, it maintains the status quo. It's always we serve you. So there's never any sense of the person being served can also become someone, right, who has gifts and skills that they bring with them, even though they come from another country. So this is always the same. They're always the receivers of charity, but never the people who get to do the work as well. And it preserves toxic narratives, us versus them. So it keeps people as other, right? They are other, there's us, and then there's them. And we have programming and practices as well. And what this language says is that we do things for immigrants, but we don't learn at their feet. We don't include them in planning and programming. We don't ask for their feedback to evaluate programming. And we don't see their contributions and gifts because we think of them as having less in every way. So when I was in Guatemala, my father was an engineer. And it's funny because he came here and he didn't speak English, and gradually, he learned English, and he still, Spanish is still his dominant heart language, but he speaks English well. And sometimes, he would tell me how people would treat him like he wasn't smart, and he would tell them, I speak with an accent, but I don't think with an accent. I understand you. I understand how to do this. But there's a way in which we treat immigrants like they must have less in every way, rather than, they've moved to a new land. They need time to adjust and adapt to this new space, right? And so these are the implications that are really, frankly, very serious. I see this, I work in an organization that's predominantly white, that is Christian, and that works with refugees and other immigrants. And this is something that we're working on. Not just thinking of immigrants as, what I hear often is, there's so much resilience that refugees have. And I'm like, that's true, but that was brought on by their trauma, by their displacement. They also have other gifts. Some refugees were accountants, were engineers, were teachers, they have other aspects of their experience other than their refugee status and their trauma. And this is not, the conversation never seems to go beyond that. And so this is why the language that we use really matters. So I want to give you an example of some of the way that I've seen this happen. So this was a campaign that was done for immigrants. And it says, this Valentine's Day, join us. We're going to be Christ's hand and feet by showing love to all of God's children by sending cards to immigrants in detention. And if it tells you how to send the card, we suggest including your name and the state, how you can download and send them. And I thought this was a really interesting campaign because on the one hand, I understand the heart and the intention behind it, right? Wanting to do something for immigrants and refugees. Here's the thing, though. These are immigrants that are in detention. I don't think this does anything for immigrants themselves. I think this makes the sender feel better about sending a card. The person doesn't even know if the person receiving this card celebrates Valentine's Day or knows anything about it. They're sending them to nameless, faceless people. You're just putting your name on it and it's going out to them. There's no mention of translation, right, of these cards so that it comes in the person's language if they don't know English. And so I think this is an example of someone trying to do something that's really good. But again, just sending something out that isn't going to have a lot of impact on the people receiving it. They may not even understand the message or what it is. So this is the importance of thinking about language and the way that we do things and who is benefiting from the work that we do. I've seen this also happen in churches. There's a really great church here in Baltimore that did something I thought really interesting. They were having a, fall kind of festival. And this is a Lutheran church that has ended up in a neighborhood that's now become predominantly Central American. And so what they did is instead, they thought about what they wanted to call this festival. Initially, they wanted to do something like to welcome, the community, but they decided to call it Neighbors Welcoming Neighbors, because they said, we don't want them to think that this is our neighborhood. It's not. It belongs to all of us. Everyone who lives here, the neighborhood belongs to all of us. And so they decided to call it that in order to make the people who live there know, like, hey, we're your neighbor. You're our neighbor. But all of us here are the same. And I appreciated the thoughtfulness they brought, to the language they used. When the pandemic started, this church reached out to the community around them. A lot of, immigrant families where both parents were essential workers. And they said, we would like to support, our neighborhood families. And we want to know what you need. And a lot of the families responded, we would love help with our children because we don't, a lot of families don't have Wi-Fi at home, don't have their own internet. They just use their phone. And then the kids were doing distance learning. So the church opened up and they created, social distancing spaces. They got a bunch of people who are elderly and others to volunteer and to help the kids with their work. So the kids were able to use the Wi-Fi in the church, and they were able to have an adult around who they could talk to, if they had trouble with school. And I thought this was very powerful because one, they thought about, instead of deciding for the families, oh, this is what you need, they asked them, what can we do? And the family says, this is how you can help us, And so then the church responded and said, okay, we'll open up our space. We'll let people use our Wi-Fi. And I appreciated the posture that they took, not making decisions on behalf of the immigrant families, but asking and getting feedback, and asking for, how they might be able to serve rather than just making assumptions. And so anyway, I think it can also be the words can be used for very good things, like in the examples with that church here in Baltimore, or it can be something like this that only benefits one person, in this case here being the sender. But the way that we do things and the words that we use really do matter to the people in our communities. So I'm going to stop there and stop share. And yeah, I wanted to open up. I don't want to take up all our time with this presentation, but yeah, I wanted to ask you if you had questions, comments. Sure.
It's very interesting what you are talking about. I never thought in that way. I really have found out that I'm not good with social justice. And now that you are talking and explaining how we are sometimes rejected by seeing you. How can I explain it? How we can reject someone by just trying to do in our thought that we are doing good, but really we are not. And those are a great examples that you are putting right there. And I never thought about it till now that you are exposing that. Is very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Antonieta. It is a really it has to be a shift in our thinking, right? About it, because I think so much of the language in the church influences the way that we're able to think about things too. Yeah. Sure, Dottie.
It reminds me of my growing up days. My parents were missionaries in Nogales, Mexico. My dad started a church there. And so anyway, Lutheran churches across the U.S. would send their youth teams to come and do a mission trip in Mexico. It was an easy one to do right on the border. And the church folk always had this feeling that they would come to help. They would do something like painting a room, or some project like that, or passing out food. But one of the things that I remember my dad always saying to them before they went over to the Mexico context is, so what will you be receiving? Because they came thinking they were going to give, but always they left receiving so much more than they gave. They gave some material things, but they received, amazing spiritual gifts back from a people who embraced them, loved them, taught them some joy, and taught them some culture, and welcomed them into their homes I think our churches in the U.S. do that a lot. We send out mission teams and say, we're going to go help those people instead of saying, I'm going to go in this context and we're going to do a project, but I'm going to learn, I'm going to grow, I'm going to be the one receiving. So.
Yeah, there's like a mutuality in
Mm-hmm.
hospitality, right?
Mm-hmm.
That we give, but we also receive.
Mm-hmm.
But it's important to think about receiving, right? What did I learn from this experience, and what am I, how is God working in me through this as well? Mm-hmm.
Somehow connected to what Dottie and you were talking about. There was this educator scholar that I can't remember his name, but he mentioned something that I heard for the first time in terms of with words, and he said that there was this deficiency concept for everybody who is not part of a dominant culture. Mm-hmm. And I have felt that, that people will see me in that way. Karen, you talked about also your father and his accent, and you said that we see people as less in every way. I think that's what he was referring to. Mm-hmm. And but when Dottie is also talking about, so what are we going to receive? What are we going to learn? There's this dynamic where someone who is not an immigrant in this case can see themselves as, so I'm complete, I'm a full person, but these other people are deficient in every way, like you say. Mm-hmm. So thank you for saying that.
Yeah, it really takes away from the humanity of the other person when we think, I'm full, but they're not. And it's interesting to me when, I don't know if in the Olympics recently, there was a gymnast, I think from a Hmong community, from a Hmong refugee family, and she won like a medal, and people were saying, oh, this is so exciting. This is what, immigrants can do. And I'm like, also immigrants can just live a normal life and not be extraordinary, and they are still worthy of dignity. and kindness and inclusion. We don't have to do something great. And I think that gets at another piece here is I think we have a myth about what a good immigrant is, right? And it includes a lot of the things that you see there on the slide, right? Someone who's hardworking and who migrated legally, even though there's not a lot of avenues for legal migration. Someone who exists to serve white people as a cleaning lady or gardener or farm worker. Someone who never gets public benefits, who keeps their head down, who is grateful, who is like my ancestors. People think that, the ancestors that came from Europe are different than the ones that are coming from Central and South America or Africa or Asia. They speak fluent English. They assimilate fully. They're exceptionally talented, right? The exotic entertainer, the Justin Biebers and Melania Trumps, right? People who are supermodels and singers. But there's a myth out there around this, right? That there are good immigrants and bad immigrants, and that certain people, right, qualify as good immigrants. And I believe this kind of rhetoric really harms, all immigrants, because is it biblical to think of people in this way? And how does it affect our perceptions of people? And how does it take away from the image of God in them? And how does it affect immigrants to be under this kind of scrutiny, right? Of having to be good or having to, or being classified as bad for whatever reason. There are families that come to World Relief to receive legal services, and the moms, sometimes they're single moms, sometimes they're married, but both parents are working and struggling, and they often have U.S. citizen children who receive women and children, the WIC, and SNAP benefits for their children. And they're working and contributing to the economy. They pay taxes because undocumented immigrants pay taxes, and yet people don't want their U.S. citizen children to receive these benefits, and they're almost classified as, bad immigrants because their kids receive these benefits. That's what these benefits are for. They're for people in need, and yet, we have this kind of language around it, and yeah, I feel that it's a harmful thing as well. Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Dottie.
So I'm thinking about, in our context here in Arizona, we were one of the locations, Texas also, but where children were placed in facilities that looked like cages without their parents, and with the facilities were so cold, they were called ice boxes, and in that period of time, the children were demonized by some people in the news. And well, if their parents hadn't brought them here, they wouldn't be in that situation. Or, of course, they're going to be mistreated because they broke the law. And so the ways that I think your point, Karen, about the words we use matter so much, but we've just gone through this period of time where we actually allowed children to be demonized because of the journey that their family is on. And do you have any pushback on how we can get to that point where we allow the demonization to be so fully grown and blown up that even our children are not saved?
Yeah, and I think that speaks right to the dehumanization. All of a sudden, these people are less and they're different. And, when I hear rhetoric like that, and I hear that sometimes when I go to churches from congregants, and they'll ask questions like that. And I always say, okay, can we agree that these children are no different than your children? They share the same humanity. Can we agree on that? Because I think it's important to remind people of that. They really do somehow see these children as different, And it's, I saw it even when I was a public school teacher. I saw the way that sometimes teachers treated kids who were newly arrived in the country. And I worked in Florida, so it was a lot of kids from either Cuba or Puerto Rico that came in, and I saw that, and I think that's the first thing is, can we agree, and can we agree that despite anything their parents did, children don't deserve to be imprisoned, whatever may have happened, I ask people to consider, what would drive you? What would be your breaking point to send a child alone, on a journey? What would be yours? And I was watching a documentary the other day about the Holocaust, and it was talking about Jewish families who sent their kids away alone, and it was desperation. It was the same kind of desperation, right, that drove them to do that. Nobody would want to be separated from their child. And so I try to bring the conversation back to there rather than starting with the detention, going back and helping people to see that. And, that is really a Holy Spirit work in their heart. You can only do so much as a pastor and as someone who cares about immigrants. And a lot of it is this, it goes back to that idea. They have an idea in their mind of who's a good immigrant, and these are bad ones, right? They've decided these are bad ones. But that's really, there's no, we have a mythology in the United States around immigration, but it always starts in a boat in some foreign land, right? And it goes through Ellis Island with the Statue of Liberty. That's not the way migration has happened for 100 years. It's not the way it's happened, but that's the mythology that people have in their heads around the good kind of an immigrant person. And so I think it's important to challenge that and to say, to go back, we have a shared humanity. And, part of what I tell people is when people say things to me like, well, why don't they just get in line? I kind of go through, there's only 4 ways to get into the US. It's not like it used to be in Ellis Island days. Sometimes they process 5,000 people a day. Only people who had tuberculosis didn't get in, It's not like that anymore. Sometimes there's only 5,000 work visas for a whole year in the United States. And so I also remind people, our system is complex. There are really, really long lines. And the fact is, we have labor needs. We have 2 signs at the border, right? One of them says, keep out. The other one says, help wanted. And the fact is, immigrants come in and they're able to get jobs, and their employers are almost never penalized for hiring someone who's undocumented, right? So, when that man asked me that in the church about, he was asking me about, well, I don't, I just think people should come the legal way. And I said, what do we do with the fact that we have the IRS and the Social Security Administration receiving payments from people who are undocumented and giving them identification numbers so they can pay taxes? And then you have DHS saying they shouldn't be here. What do we do with these conflicting responses, Because if our government is doing that, now think about employers. They're doing that too, right? They're bringing in people and hiring them, and in many cases exploiting the labor, right? So it's always a lot more complex than what people make it out to be. But I always try to bring it back to our shared humanity. Can we agree on that? Can we agree these children no different than your children? Okay, let's say you're correct. The parents were wrong. What would drive any parent to do something like this, to put their child on a train alone? I'm not telling you that it always works, but if you can get people to think about those realities, I think that's an important step for people. They say that people have to encounter the truth 7 times before they're able to change their mind about anything. So I think it's okay for us to just have the conversation, understanding that they may not, change it. And I want you to know, I think it's okay to start with words of welcome when we're talking to people, when it's a brand new idea, the idea of being open and welcoming to immigrants. I just think we should move them along, that should be the beginning of the conversation, not the beginning and the end, which is often what it is in many churches, and that's why when something new happens, like unaccompanied minors coming to the border, all of a sudden they, oh, no, I welcome the refugees only. I welcome all of a sudden they start dividing people into groups that are worthy and unworthy. And that's why I think we start with welcome, but we keep, for lack of a better word, discipling people along the road to where they start to think about things like solidarity, like kinship and mutuality, and not just being stuck with hospitality.
Karen, one of the things that really got my attention when I read your book is just the fact that not all immigrants' experiences are the same.
Mm-hmm.
Just going through this whole process, I mean, there's the experience for a woman who's bringing their children across the border is different from the experience of the children or a man who's coming over here for a job. I mean, this is of course that's a reality, but that's one of the things that I've been trying to explain to people as well, is that I'm an immigrant myself, but my journey is very different as as a straight cisgender able-bodied man. My journey is very different from someone else who's coming across the border, and it's hard to and we shouldn't just generalize, talk about immigrants in a way that is, well, this is what immigrants go through, or this is what immigrants have to do, or whatever. I mean, it's different for different people. And I was wondering if, because I know you're working on another book, and you're talking about that as well, sexual minorities, or so would you talk about that just a little bit, please?
Yeah, so that's absolutely right. There are all immigrants have a different experience in terms of, their experiences can vary. I have two good friends, who are Latinas, and my friend Sandy migrated. She was here on a student visa, and then she got a job, and her employer sponsored her to stay here, and that's how she got a green card. My family was undocumented. We were undocumented for about 3 years before thankfully we had a relative, my uncle, who sponsored my father. And then, my father we were able to be his derivatives as part of that petition. And then my other friend, Jennifer, she's also from Guatemala, but her parents were pastors on the Caribbean coast of Guatemala. And then they were sponsored by their denomination to come to the US, and work in San Diego. So there's just 3 of us, and we all have a different experience of what it is to migrate to the US. I always share this information with people when I talk about migration, that blood, sweat, tears, and luck, these are the only ways to migrate. And if you're looking at tears, this is the refugees. You're talking about a lot of trauma, a lot of really terrible experiences. And the truth is that the people who come to the southern US borderlands, if it weren't for politics and the fact that it's the United States in many cases that has created the reasons for people's migration, for example, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, it bankrupted thousands of farmers. They couldn't compete with the price of corn that was so low that was being imported from the US. So they lost their livelihood, they lost their land. And what did that result in? Migration. Right? In Central America, you have the United States, who was funding the civil wars in El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Panama, all these places, right, where there's been a lot of interference from the United States that created the instability and that created a lot of repression and a lot of persecution of indigenous people, especially, right? And what has happened with that is that's also created migration. Well, guess what? All of that falls under tiers, all of that. But politically, the United States doesn't classify those people as refugees. And so they get classified as people who can seek asylum, right? But we know only 10% of asylum applications are approved. And so there's a large category here of people who should have legal right to migrate under tiers, but who can't. And so they're looking under blood. Do they have any close relatives, right? Who can sponsor them? We were lucky. We had my dad's brother who married a US citizen. You know, if my Tío Hugo, if you were going to sponsor us today, let's say my family was leaving Guatemala today, the wait is now 13 years for an immigrant visa. 13 years we would have to wait to get that visa. If we had migrated today, I would not have been able to go to university. My parents would have never been able to buy a home. My father would have never been able to work as an engineer again, because we would have been living as undocumented people under the radar. So our lives would be completely different, you know, if we had migrated today. But fortunately, we migrated in 1981, where the lines were not so long as they are now. But there's a lot of really long waits. If you're from Mexico, India, China, or the Philippines, the wait is not 13 years, it's 23 years. That's how long you have to wait for your visa. If people are hungry, if their children are being persecuted in the streets, they're not going to wait 23 years to migrate legally. They're going to take the risk and come as undocumented people and come and ask for asylum, perhaps, at the US border if they qualify for that. You know, really what we should have is a lot more visas under SWET, because we have complete industries in the United States that depend on immigrant labor. Farm workers is one of them, working in poultry farms, dairy farms, slaughterhouses. Here in Baltimore, many immigrants work in industrial laundries, because we have Johns Hopkins and all its hospitals, you know, that are all over this city. And that's where immigrants do. They do that work of working in these laundries to clean all these hospital linens. And yet we don't have a lot of these visas. All we have are for people, you know, I met a woman the other day who was like a pediatric neurosurgeon from Egypt, and she got a work visa. But they don't give a lot of work visas for people in the kind of jobs that are needed, the kind of jobs that would provide an immigrant a new opportunity to enter the country. Then, of course, there's the luck, right? The online visa lottery. But this visa lottery is only for countries that are not really represented in the US. So all of Central America's out, all of Mexico's out, India, South Korea's out. So I met someone from Burundi who got this visa, but the odds are 1 in 300. So that's not very, it's not very high. So there just aren't a lot of ways that people can migrate, but it can look like any combination of all of these things, being able to migrate. When I worked at in the legal clinic, a lot of LGBTQ people would come in. And, one man came in, I remember, because he was from Cameroon, and he said that he was gay, but he was married and had a family because there's like very extreme laws against gay people in his country. And he wanted to ask for, apply for asylum and just be able to stay here in the US. Well, we told him that he could do that, but part of it was he'd have to have some kind of proof of persecution. So we told him, you have to come out to your family. Not me, the attorney told him. you have to come out to your family and let them know that you are gay, and including the people you're staying with that you're visiting here in the US. And then their response, you have to, document, keep all the text messages, emails, anything they write to you in response, and then bring that in as further proof, of your, persecution. So basically what we asked this man to do under our laws is to burn down his whole life, every social support that he has, by coming out to his whole family, and, in a place that's homophobia is so common. And then he could have proof that he didn't, he was being persecuted because of this. And so, what he did, he walked away. He chose to just go back and take his chances in his country because he couldn't, many of us who are immigrants come from cultures, right, where family is very strong, where we have strong, communal connections, and the idea of destroying all of that for an asylum application, he couldn't do it. And, some people are not able to do that, and asking them to do that is so cruel, but that's the only way he would be able to have a successful asylum petition. So, yeah, I'm not sure if that's what you were looking for, Efrain, but that's, part of part of the conversation I have with people around, these are the only ways to be able to migrate.
No, that's thank you for sharing that. It's very helpful, and just kind of understanding the situation that many immigrants face, when they're trying to come to the United States. I know our time is limited, and I want to honor your time, and but I also want to give an opportunity. I don't know if Pastor Agustin or Pastor Raul have any questions or any comments. Pastor Agustín, Pastor Raúl, ¿tienen algún comentario o alguna pregunta acerca de la discusión?
Bueno, yo voy manejando, tengo mi cámara apagada.
Uh-huh.
No, yo que vivo en el contexto de frontera, sé lo importante que es el poder nosotros relacionarnos y vivir un poco más el contexto de los migrantes. Creo que como iglesia nos toca seguir haciendo algo más por ellos y aprender a cómo lograr. Y nuevamente gracias por esta conversación.
And Pastor Raul is saying that as a church, we still have a lot to learn and how to deal with these situations in this conversation. Gracias, Pastor. Well, listen, I know it's almost...
yeah, it's okay. If you have additional questions or comments, I can hold on.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah.
I do want to say that I have a great appreciation for your book, The God Who Sees, because in our churches and my church in particular, we started to have some conversations about racism, for example. And then we learned some things, and then we hit a point where we said, well, not what. And we were struggling to find the answers to the now what. And I just found your book as to be a resource that is very comprehensive, because in one way you help us connect with those immigrant stories in the Bible that we, for some reason, continue to be disconnected with. In a very powerful way, you do that. And then all the resources that you have at the end for us to perhaps do a Bible study with it, or also for us to just do some more of different types of work or next steps that we can take. That was very helpful to me. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And that's exactly why I wrote that book. Is I was working in church engagement here in DC, Baltimore, Northern Virginia, and pastors would often tell me, like, I don't know, where to start on preaching about this, or talking about this with the congregation, or, doing a study And that's really what drove me to think about the book. Is I wanted people to be able to read the Bible and see that the Bible has so much movement of people. It has so much migration, but we don't have eyes to see it because often it's the dominant culture, right? That writes the commentaries and that has the pulpits, and so that they don't see that because that's not their experience. But it's really important to see, to see the Bible differently. One of the interesting things when I was writing that book, I started to see things I never noticed before. Like I was reading Exodus and realized, oh, Moses is he's kind of like a bicultural kid, His parents are Hebrews, right? But he's growing up in Egypt with Egyptian like guardians, right? So he's bicultural, like a lot of immigrant children, And a friend of mine wrote this article about, I wonder if Moses spoke something like Spanglish, where he couldn't always remember the Hebrew language. And so he would probably fill in with Egyptian, but that also made him a unique person, right? Moses, instead of living in privilege, because many of us immigrants who have been here a long time and now have, like me, I was educated here, I have a good job here. It can be easy to just separate ourselves from the immigrant community that's new, right? And just, but Moses, what he did is he gave up that privilege and power for the sake of God's people. And he obeyed God's call, right? To lead the people out of this oppression. And to me, it's always a very important story for me to reflect on, that these are my people. And, there's a lot of ways in which I lived my life for a long time, very separate, thinking of myself as very different, from the immigrants that are arriving now. But we're actually the same. There actually isn't any difference. The only difference is that I've been here a lot longer and that I had some privilege because I had a uncle who could sponsor me, and that changed my life completely.